Don't clap. You haven't seen the presentation yet. So, God, there's a lot of you here. I guess I'll ask a quick question at first. How many people here are students new to the industry and generally do a lot of CTFs? Cool. I'm sorry. Before I even introduce myself, I think what this talk covers and like what it's meant to do and not do is probably more important than who I am. This talk is geared towards students, newcomers, people who are interested in getting into the industry. This talk is not meant to dissuade you from joining the industry or doing pen testing. It's more of getting you used to the idea that some things that you do in CTFs don't quite pan out the way you think they do in a pen test. That said, I'm Steven. I work at a company called Proac. If you've never heard of us, that's okay. If you have, you probably listened to a talk a couple hours ago by my bosses. I've been in this industry probably far too long. About 12 years I've been doing pen testing and managing a security team. I've been a mentor to many people. Some will say I've been a good mentor, hopefully. Some will say they learned some stuff, and some will probably say I was a terrible mentor and they learned nothing from me. That's fine. I'm not wearing a Santa hat just for this conference. It's kind of my identity. So if you've seen me present, actually, this is my second time presenting at Hackfest. I presented Hackfest 8. So it's good to be back again. I should have a filler slide about what this, a bit more of the sections, but I'm just going to talk and go over this as well. So I'm going to kind of briefly go over like the different types of challenges, like the technical skills you get from them. And then I'm just going to kind of go into a rant about, yeah, these are great, but they don't actually quite apply to pen testing. And then I'm going to go a bit more about why they don't apply and like what skills, soft skills, technical skills don't quite add up. And I'm going to try and make some very vague, hand-wavy suggestions on how you can kind of like address that. So, there are so many goddamn types of Can I curse? Is that? Okay. Because this topic's kind of like passionate to me, so I will part ramble. Yeah, there's so many different types of CTF challenges. Your boot to root Windows challenges, AppSec cloud, forensics, reverse engineering, binary exploitation, and attack and defense CTF challenges, which, how many people here have actually participated in or know what an attack and defense CTF challenge is? 5, 6 people? Cool. An attack and defense CTF challenge is probably one of the more fun types of CTF challenges. But as somebody who makes a CTF, it's a pain in the ass to run. So you won't see them, typically. So what happens is you build a network, or you've gotten a network, you get an hour to defend it, harden systems, change passwords, and you have like 20 teams doing the same thing. And then after like an hour, everybody goes loose. It's a real great simulation of kind of what it is like to pen test and defend a network. Because you may have found something cool while you were patching, and you're going to like exploit another team, or like you're exploiting every team because you're like, I don't think they did this. Meanwhile, another team's found something else that you didn't think of, and they're just running through your systems. So these are kind of the high levels. Each different style of challenge kind of teaches you something different. I'm going to go over like the 3, 4 major groups that you will encounter in CTFs like Hackfest, Plaid, the DEF CON quals, Hack the Box, stuff like that. Your boot to root challenges, your Windows style challenges. Oh God, I can't. lean back too far. These typically teach you like the normal stuff you'd find for like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. How do you figure out what challenge, how do you figure out how do you get into this system? Once you've gotten into the system, I know information gathering isn't the right thing to call it, but that's what I'm going to call it in these slides. Information gathering is more of like, hey, are there any files or scripts or anything like that that contain sensitive information? So Windows shares, Excel sheets with passwords, stuff like that. The wonderful script with the admin password for the domain. Then how do you take that information, move and pivot to another system? Or if you're on a low priv system, how do you gain privileges? Fairly straightforward. Your web app skills. Your normal OWASP top 10, how do you kind of go and identify what types of normal web challenges are there? Something that comes with a bit of experience is if you see certain behaviors, you're like, they're using this framework. That means that if they haven't configured this properly, I can go do something else over here. So CTFs are really good at like helping you build an exposure to a bunch of different like web applications, frameworks, implementations, and languages. My favorite one is PHP is actually not as insecure as you think it is. And in more advanced CTF challenges, like your Web 4 and 500s, you kind of figure out how to chain these things together. So you end up with, I found stored XSS from a user to an admin. How do I then trigger it and get a call back to another server? Really cool. I know Hackfest, NSEC, and Plaid will do stuff like that for like their higher level challenges. So that's a good skill. Reverse engineering, binary exploitation, and forensics, I'm terrible at. This is not my claim to fame. But it has been useful in some pen testing engagements. So forensics helps you with that information gathering. If you're going through a system and you find like obscure backup files that are like synced across a server, if you file like image files from when they were doing forensics of their own or they were testing something. Oh, good God, Patrick, where are you? I've already had a shot, Patrick.
I don't care.
So, well, Patrick makes me regret my day.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for accepting me.
Cheers.
So, yeah, figuring out obscure file formats that you may not normally encounter and figuring out how to carve a file system, extract files out of it, is a useful skill when you're kind of in the weeds in a pen test. Reverse engineering and some binary exploitation is also useful. My skills as reverse engineering is I can run strings, and I can use dnSpy for like .NET applications. That's literally it. But it has come in handy. Because you will have clients who will write their custom application to do some kind of automation, and figuring out that they've hard-coded something in there to like talk to a service account is useful. Like I say, just because it's not my skill set doesn't mean that it's not a useful skill set. There are some things that you need to remember about a CTF. They're vulnerable by design. And I've seen a lot of people come into, they've done a lot of CTFs. I'm going to pick on PHP because why not? They're like, hey, I did a CTF. This version of PHP was vulnerable to this thing. PHP is garbage. It's exploitable. And depending on how complicated the app is, I let them spin their wheels, because the joys of a CTF is it's vulnerable, yes, but with proper frameworks, it's actually hard to get an exploitation path for that very niche PHP bug that somebody had to like probably cross-compile to make sure that it was actually vulnerable and configure it in such a way that it's actually exploitable, which happens in the real world, but not as much. CTFs are great playgrounds. They're meant for you to try whatever you want. There are no consequences to doing anything in a CTF. For the most part, I guess. During a CTF, you can spend as much time as you want on a challenge. You can go into a CTF and go, hey, I'm going to spend this CTF working on only the reverse engineering challenges. I'm going to build this skill set. And I'm going to spend the whole 12 hours doing it. If I get a flag, great. If you tell a client that you spent 12 of their 20 hours looking at one thing, start writing your resume. Because you will probably be fired unless you have a good boss who like has covered the rest of the coverage for you. Because clients have expectations. How many people here who do CTFs and clean up after themselves on test boxes? Yeah, okay. I once had a pen test that I was in charge of, and the joys of Metasploit. Somebody ran something, it worked, but it failed to give us a shell back. We didn't realize this. Fast forward 6 months. This server has now been backed up, copied over a share, and AV has been triggered. And we now get a wonderful email from the client being like, hey, is this you? 6 months later? I'm like, no? Maybe? Let me go check back our notes. Thankfully, I still had all our notes. I asked the people that I was working with at that time to do like a screen record of everything they were doing. And I kept copies of that. So I was able to kind of go through what everybody did and was like, oh, that was us. It's a very embarrassing email back to the client being like, hey, about that. Sorry. Please don't fire us. In a CTF, you can try anything. God, everybody here looks a bit, a lot of people here look a bit. Anybody remember DB Autopone? Yeah, that's how old I am in this industry. DB Autopone was a wonderful thing where you just click it and it would just try every exploit against a target. It was written as a joke, and people legitimately used it. How many people have done CTFs and they're like, well, I need to get a reverse shell back from a box. I'm just going to spin up netcat on an AWS instance. No? God, you're all better than I am. You can try anything without a consequence. The unfortunate side of that is when you take that mentality into a pen test, you are unfortunately wrong. Because clients have expectations and privacy expectations for the data that you are pen testing. If you have a reverse shell over HTTP that goes over the internet from a client to your C2, what are you doing? You've not only put your company's reputation, your reputation, but your client data at risk to whoever decides to sit in the middle of whatever you're doing, because BGP is secure, right? So here's the rub for a lot of skills for doing CTFs. How many people document what you do on a CTF? Three people. I don't know how many people in here, but that kind of proves the point. The only thing a client will ever see from you is your artifact of your pen test. It might be a PDF, it might be a bug bounty ticket, it might be a JIRA ticket. No matter how much time you sink into something cool, the only thing they will see are a bunch of screenshots and 2 paragraphs of whatever you choose to write. That sucks. You feel really good finding a cool thing, and it's distilled to 3 screenshots, 2 paragraphs that nobody will read. Some CTFs that are standalone, like a bunch of like the free hack in the box stuff, they don't really teach you how to chain things together. If you get access to a box and you find that there's a configuration file with an API key in it, and that box has nothing to do with an API key, CTFs have trained you to move on to the next thing, and when you find the next thing, you typically forget everything behind you. Whereas, like the Hackfest CTF, or at least the Windows side of it, they chain things together so that it takes you from point A to point 5, like a path, almost kind of like an escape room kind of thing. But because you've been trained to go from point A to point B without really remembering what's happened before, that API key that you found on that first box during your information gathering is actually used in box 5 as a web interface to like connect back to some other third-party integration that has the flag. And then you spend a bulk of your time going down the rabbit hole trying to figure out, hey, what's on this box that I can use? But the answer was an hour ago, and because CTFs train you to forget about it, you do. You really don't talk to anybody during a CTF. The end results, the consequences of your CTF is you get a flag. A client does not care about a flag. Some clients are good. Some clients are the boogeyman incarnate and will make your life a living hell. I have a whole slide on clients later, so that shows you how like boogeyman-ish they are. You don't learn meaningful recommendations for doing CTFs. And that may not sound important, but because the only thing a client sees from you is a couple of paragraphs, your recommendations are actually important. If you go to somebody and be like, oh, just disable X certs, you're like, what does that mean? Where do I disable them? How do I disable them? Do I disable them at the top? Do I disable them at my edge? Do I disable them at the machine itself? Where do I implement these findings? And because you don't interact with the clients and because you don't have that particular skill, a lot of times I've reviewed a lot of reports for people who have just started, and their recommendations have been, if I copy the first sentence, I will find a blog post that has this exact recommendation. You've provided no value to a client at that point. And when you do a CTF, you don't really see the big picture, because everything's kind of siloed and like move along the path. You don't get the time to understand that, hey, this application is only a front end to 20 other applications that talk to each other in the back end that do a bunch of data transfer, and you never get to see the big picture. Actually, even as a pen tester, you don't get to see the big picture a lot because you're siloed into doing a particular thing. I've had the joy to mentor a lot of people, and a lot of times, like, the first thing that somebody will say when they do a test is, oh, I can't believe they had this configured this way. And that kind of hurts, because you're expecting everybody to do the right thing when everybody else has a time crunch. And I see this a lot with like the more older part of our industry, where it's like it's the security way or no way at all. And that's not the right way to kind of go about getting people involved in a project. because that's how people end up with, like, security does nothing good. They only slow me down. Why do I talk to them? I'm just going to bypass them and do some janky something in the back end. Kind of talk with this bee without a wonderful graph. CTFs don't have a scope. It's your playground. You can do whatever you want. How many people here deal with bug bounties? 2.5. Bug bounties have a scope. Kind of. They say they have a scope. Nobody listens to it. I've had the joy of managing a couple of bug bounty programs and had the scope clearly defined. Hey, x.subdomain.com, and we'll have tens of reports for SSL on y.subdomain.com. I'm like, cool. Thanks for the information. We know this. But did you read our scope? And then the inevitable follow-up is, so when do I get my money? I'm like, thank you for playing along. You do not, please read our scope. You found something in a domain that we don't care about. If it's something cool, yeah, you will typically get the reward for it because I'm not an asshole. If it's a good finding, yeah. But I'm also tired of 10 bug bounty reports for, hey, you're using a vulnerable version of SSL or TLS, but it's not actually vulnerable. Thanks. A pentest has a very defined scope. That's going to be, I want to say, your biggest shock going from a bug bounty. Forgot my own talk. From going from a CTF to a pentest. I will talk a lot more about scope because I have a whole slide on it. It's that important. CTFs don't require documentation. I will harp on this the whole time. The only thing a client will see is a write-up from you. Bug bounties, the only thing they will see is that wonderful submission form where you try to cram as much information or a video and hope they understand. If you can't explain to somebody why this is important, they will not care. And it's the same thing with a pen test. CTFs have a time limit. Kind of. Depends on the type of CTFs you do. Hackfest has a time limit. You get 12 hours to run yourself ragged and mad. Boot to root challenges, you can take 2 hours to do it. You can take a year. It doesn't matter as long as you get it done. Pentest, unless you have a good relationship with your client, change management is a pain in the ass. Especially if you can't manage your time. If you go to a client and go, hey, I know we said this would take 2 weeks, but I kind of got distracted and went down a rabbit hole and I spent 2 days looking at something that unfortunately didn't turn to anything. I need more time. Good luck. Good luck getting that past your manager at first. Some managers might be cool. If you work for the Big Four, probably not. Yeah, everything builds a skill. You could do the same thing over and over, and if you're not learning something from it, you're doing something wrong. If you're not... The joys of, like, the CTF is you get to build a very wide set of skills. Pen testing and bug bounties will teach you to make those skills more efficient because timelines are a pain in the ass. In a pen test, your timeline is your scope. In a bug bounty, your timeline is until the other guy finds it. If he finds it first, you don't get anything. So you got to figure out a way to make your process as efficient as possible to get the most coverage done in the shortest amount of time so that you can get that money instead of somebody else. I'm going to kind of gloss over Can Try Anything. I think you're tired of hearing me talk about that. You don't have to describe a finding impact to anybody during a CTF. Your impact is your flag. You found your flag. You've shown that you've done something and made a good impact. there's no flags in the real world. Has anybody told you that? I've had times, should I be outing myself like this? I've had times where like I've successfully exploited findings and didn't have a clue I did. I've had times where I've like done like testing for cross-site scripting, focused on it for a day, found nothing. 2 days later, I'm going through some other random part of the app, and I'm just getting prompts. I'm just like, where did you come from? Where were you? I guess I didn't like that. Where were you 2 days ago when I was looking through you? I'm like, ooh, you know what? That's my payload for that was script 1. It took me forever to figure out what was executing it with 20-something plus payloads of it in other parts of the application. So do yourself a favor. If you're testing something like that in bulk, give everything a different identifier. It will save you 2 hours of being like, what's executing? Let me see. There's no clients for a bug. There's no clients for everything but the CTF. I'm gonna say clients who do bug bounties have no expectations to find anything useful, because 90% of what comes into a bug bounty is garbage. It's low-hanging fruit things that don't apply. Or the finding or the write-ups themselves make no sense. I once had a finding come in where it's like, hey, I can do, what was it? I can do privilege escalation from a user that has no permissions to access this feature. I can access it. I'm like, oh shit, that's actually pretty bad. But that was their entire description of the finding. I'm just like, and they had like 4 other findings that were also inconsequential. I was just like, oh. Ciphers that don't apply. If anybody managed a bug bounty when like Zombie Poodle came out, if you were running behind Cloudflare wasn't vulnerable, but everybody was still emailing me being like, hey, it's vulnerable. I'm like, it's not. Go read the blog post. So it was a bunch of trash like that. And then this one nugget, I'm just like, okay. So I email them back. I'm like, hey, your other findings aren't unfortunately quite up to snuff, but can you tell me more about this other finding? Guess what my reply was? So when do I get my money? It's like, I'd love to pay you out, but I can't validate your finding based on this sentence. I've tried myself and I couldn't do it. Can you please send me more information? We'll be happy to pay it out for you. So where's my money? I can't validate this for you. Can you please give me a bit more context? And once we validate it, happy to pay you out. So, and then I went to my manager and I'm like, hey, can I block this guy? Like, he's not giving me any useful information. I tried a bunch of different things for this and it didn't work, so. And he's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I'm like, cool. So I went into Gmail and I blocked him globally from our company. Because realistically, people like that, they will try other people and they'll just get forwarded to me anyway. So I'm going to save myself that wonderful headache. Another part of your client expectations with a pen test is they expect a report. They kind of expect you to get coverage of an application or what they've asked you to test. Kind of makes sense, right? They're paying you the money. They kind of want to make sure that what they're paying you for got done. Scope is the most terrifying thing as a junior pen tester. Scope can be frustrating because it can limit you to a crawl Or it can be so wide open that you just get overwhelmed by what the hell am I supposed to be doing? Since Elon bought Twitter, I'm going to make fun of him for this one. Twitter is now going to be rolling out a new feature that lets you play music on your pages. Anybody remember MySpace? Yeah. What's old is new. They're like, hey, so we're rolling out this feature. We want you to test it. You're like, cool, I get to test Twitter. The reality of what you're testing is you're testing 5 APIs. You're testing an API to upload your music. You're testing an API to delete your music. You're testing a get endpoint that lets you check your settings. You're testing a get endpoint that lets you preview your music. Am I out of time? Oh, okay. And you're testing a get endpoint that the general public uses. That kind of testing sucks. Because while you're testing, you're like, oh, look at all these other cool features that I could be looking at. And say you get 5 days to test these 5 things. You're going to kind of wonder. And you unfortunately start looking at other things and you find something and you're like, cool, I found this other thing. But it's not in scope. What do you do? Hands up if they do nothing with it. Okay, good, at least you're all ethical. Hands up if you include it in the report. 2, 3, 4, cool. 5, 6, cool. Thanks for keeping the hands low so that I can actually count them. I'm not good at math. So, how many people let the client know out of band? What do the rest of you do? Oh, that's fair. The comment was, put it on Twitter, they'll see it. Yeah, that kind of sucks to put you in that position because you've now found something potentially cool. It's not in scope, so you can't really include it in the report. I mean, you can, but it's going to raise a lot of questions. Hey, we asked you to test these 5 things. What's something for like authentication doing here? It's like we didn't ask you to look at OAuth. You're like, yeah, but I did. Value add. No. Fine. The other part is scope can be overwhelming. If you're doing a network test for a new client, you end up with, hey, they asked us to do a test. Cool. What's the scope? Oh, they have 20/16s. And you're like, how much time do we have? You're like, 4 person weeks. Like, cool. 4 person weeks, that seems reasonable, right? Well, it's not great, but it's not terrible. Until you realize that person weeks and weeks are different things. Typically, a business will say a person week. So when you start this wonderful project with your senior tester, Tony, and you look at your schedule, and you're like, cool, Tony and I are on this for 4 weeks. Awesome. No, Tony and you are on this for 2 weeks because a person week is a total effort of the amount of time, of the amount of people, and the amount of time. So you now have gone from 4 weeks of testing, where you could get decentish coverage to 2 people for 2 weeks, which isn't great. You end up with, hopefully Tony knows what he's doing, because if not, you're going to spend your first week spinning your wheels trying to figure out how to get data in this massive environment. And then you're going to spend the first 4 days of the next week figuring, what the hell do these results mean? Because you have 20/16 to go through. That's a lot of data. /16 is what, 65,000-ish? Nobody with a quick subnet? Cool. Yeah, 65,000 times 20, 60. 1.2 million hosts? Yeah, that seems like a bit more unrealistic for 2 weeks now, for 2 people for 2 weeks, doesn't it? How do you get coverage for that? You don't. You realistically don't. There's no clean way, no matter how efficient your senior tester Tony is you will not get that much time to cover everything. And unfortunately, you got to learn to accept that. And the reality of it sucks. Because you now feel like you're not doing enough to help your client be better. Because isn't that why you got into pen testing? It's like help the industry get better. It's like help people do the right thing and like make things more secure. Or did you get in because you wanted the clout? Because you can get the clout in 2 weeks, no problem. But you haven't benefited your client in any way. Time management sucks. When you're covering 1.2 million hosts in 2 weeks with 2 people, you got to learn how to use that time effectively. If your senior person's any good, he may let you go down a rabbit hole once or twice and hopefully draw you back up before you waste too much time. But he's going to need, realistically, he's going to need you to do something useful. Typically, projects like this are fixed cost. Whether the project is scoped for you to work 80 hours and you work 120, you're not doing anybody any good. I know that doesn't make sense because you kind of want to like put in the effort to make sure the project gets done so you look good, right? Your mental health is actually worth it. If it's underscoped in such a way that you can't get the coverage the client wants, don't just sit there and grumble about it. Let somebody know. At the end of the day, you are responsible for A, that work, and B, yourself. If you put in 120 hours for an 80-hour project, you have given your company and your client 40 hours of work that you could have been doing something that actually mattered to you. Sleep. I don't know. The company will try and run you ragged as much as possible. Don't let them. Be good at managing your time, and if you see that it's going way out there, let somebody know. That said, I'm not going to say that I'm very guilty of this. I won't lie to you. Like, I've put in probably far too many hours on projects that needed it because I cared about the output. I have a very good friend who says you're only as good as your last report, which is very true. Because realistically, because the report's the only thing they see, that's the only thing they care about. And if you've constantly put in 40 extra hours on a project every time and then you suddenly don't, and that report doesn't look as good or like as coveraged, then then management starts to question you. It's just like, but why? And like, if you then complain about it after doing it for 2 years, it kind of loses its effect. That said, sometimes projects are interesting enough that, a bit of extra time is okay. I'm not saying don't do it all the time, but unfortunately sometimes it's a thing because clients are late with certain things, or sometimes life happens. Like sometimes you need to go to a doctor. Sometimes you need to go pick somebody up. Just make sure that you understand that your time has a value and that you're not using it in a way that you're giving it away to the client. Does that kind of make sense? Good. Value your time. It's important. If you don't, then they're just going to keep taking your time away. Don't be like me. Take vacation. Most clients don't care what the hell you do. You think I may be joking. I am not. One of the most disheartening things I've done as a pen tester in 10 years as a pen tester, I tested a client, I did an annual assessment for a client for 6 years. The first year was great. I found a bunch of stuff. It was like a web app test of like 6 applications that were publicly facing. Like this was their bread and butter. Found a bunch of cool stuff. Came back the second year. Nothing changed. The first report took me like 3 days to write. The second report took me 6 hours. Because I literally copied the old report, updated the times, and added whatever new findings there were from changes in SSL, changes in like their libraries, new findings in their old libraries. I didn't get good coverage the first time. I was junior as all hell. I found new things. I gained new skills. I'm like, I didn't look at this last time. And those were the only updates, was new findings we had. I didn't have to remove any of the old findings, including like, hey, you don't have HTTP on your cookies. That's a fairly easy fix in the framework you're using. 6 years, not even that was updated. And it was shortly after that I left consulting. Because that sucks. You've put in this effort, you've done a bunch of stuff, and nothing happens. I'm not saying all clients are like this, but there are a certain subset of clients that do your annual checkbox. You come in, you're like, yeah, check. Because the checkbox says, hey, have you done a pen test? Yes. There's no checkbox to say, hey, have you fixed anything from that pen test? It will be disheartening. I'm not going to lie to you. It sucked. Like, that was one of the main reasons I left consulting, was because I was tired of, like, issuing reports for, like, a bunch of, like, repeat customers and nothing was fixed. It felt like I had no impact whatsoever. And then 2 years later, I went back into consulting because I'm an idiot. The people that you're working with are people. They have a full-time job. They have other priorities. Their goal is not to babysit you and make you feel good. They have other internal worries that they have to worry about. And they will fight you on almost anything. It's like, hey, I think this finding's critical because I can do X. If it's critical, that means you have to fix it in 3 weeks. Our sprint's a bit full for like the next 3 sprints. Can we make that a high? That way we can maybe get it done in 2 months? No. But that's their reality. They've managed all their development out, and like they're running on tight timelines already as it is. You throwing in a finding, no matter how important it is to you, they have other priorities. They're trying to push out this new feature that will make them $100,000 a month because that is their priority. I'm not saying it's great, but you have to understand and empathize and figure out a way to properly describe the impact. If you can't describe the impact to them properly in a way that they care about, they won't care about your finding. They also have expectations. I've had times where clients say like, hey, test this application. Come back and like, hey, you didn't find this finding that we knew about internally. Shit. And you're like, all right, hold on. It's a draft report. Give us an hour. You go back and you look at the feature and you're like, I still can't figure this out. And you come back and you're like, hey, we have no amendments to the report. And then you later find out that it's some obscure thing that you wouldn't have found because it's a time-based. And you're like, when their back-end batch process kicks off, something happens, you're like, I can't see your back-end process. Why are you teasing me like this? I've had that happen multiple times. And like, at first, it sucked. I eventually learned to keep a straight face and go, okay. Sorry that we missed it. Can you give me a bit more context so that we can maybe verify it for ourselves? And then they go through this, and you're like, yeah. I'm like, you do realize we can't see that, right? Because what ended up happening some of the times was you would input something, and at 2 a.m., their AIX boxes, because they're that old, kicks off some batch thing that failed that you can't see, that doesn't affect the application, but some other application downstream. And you're like, cool. I'd love to put that in the report, but we have a scope. See, it all ties together. How do you build these missing skills? If you're doing CTFs, try to do write-ups. Try to put yourself in the mentality that, hey, you know what? Somebody's going to see the end result of it. I'm going to post my write-ups online. That way you go through and you learn to figure out what screenshots are meaningful. My favorite one is, hey, we got AD. And you're like, cool. Sorry, we got AD. We got DA. What does that mean to me? Like, but here's the screenshot. I'm like, cool. I don't know what this means as an executive. Why am I paying for this? So start doing write-ups of stuff. Do postmortems with your teammates. That way you're bouncing ideas off of what potential like impacts or like how you can word things better that people might understand. For certain challenges, if you're inclined, try to actually fix it and then retest it. That way you actually build a meaningful way of like, oh, hey, the general thing of like patch X doesn't actually apply because the patch doesn't work, or you need to patch and actually like change a configuration. Thanks, Microsoft. How do you deal with clients? Find a mentor, or find a friend who used to work in customer service and just have them be their worst nightmare. See, you joke, but it helps. Like we used to do that at the company I used to work at. We used to do L&G sessions where like the senior consultants would play the Karen client, and we would make the junior people like squirm and like not feel very comfortable. Because clients will be like that. Clients will ask you the most obscure questions and on the spot, and you just have to be like, and the joys of a consultant you can't break because you have the image of the company to maintain. So find a mentor. Find somebody who can like help you walk through these scenarios or like how to approach certain things. I had a slide here for more rambling if I ran out of time, but I don't have much time. I have a couple of minutes, so I'll actually, anybody have questions?
When you're facing a project or whether you don't find anything useful or insightful, what do you recommend to do when you have that?
Right. So the question is, if you have a project and you don't find anything useful, that happens. You're going against other people. They can do their jobs well. That's why I say a CTF will always be vulnerable. If you're going up against somebody who knows what they're doing, they might have actually written a good application. It is mentally taxing as all hell. Don't get me wrong. I've had projects where like 4 days in, I'm like, I haven't found anything, not even a cookie flag. What am I missing? And it's a good mindset to have to like figure, but at the end of the day, if you give a client a clean report, they'll probably be happy as all hell. But there's always a part of the report that has a wonderful caveat of, this is a time box assessment. We can't necessarily find everything. But yeah, you will run into clients and networks and web apps that actually do things properly that you can't exploit, or you can't find any useful things to exploit in, or like you won't have any good findings. And that goes back to you're only as good as your last report. You found nothing. You feel like shit. The client feels great. And you've questioned what you've spent 5 days doing. And you sit there and it gnaws at me. Because like, I'll just keep on going back being like, what did I miss? And sometimes the answer is nothing. But that's a good question. Anybody else?
When you do a job on site for the client, sometimes you negotiate a get out of jail card, something should happen.
So the question was, sometimes you're doing like on-site assessments and you need a get out of jail free card. Yes. I've been involved in an assessment where the person on site got blown. But he didn't have a get out of jail free card. He did manage to talk his way out of it. But they took a copy of his license and they posted it on the fridge being like, hey, if you see this guy in the building again, let us know. And then we went in and like we did like a meeting with like their team and they happily gave us that evidence, copy of his PII. So I did the natural thing and I cut out his PII and posted it on our fridge. This is what happens when you have sloppy OPSEC. But yes, depending on the type of assessments you're doing, you will fail. No matter how good you think you are, somebody's better at doing their job and they will catch you. So make sure that if you're doing stuff like that, that letter has 2 people. Because one of them might be at lunch. Or might not want to answer their phone. Because that's also happened. So 2 people. Not legal advice. And I'm now cutting into your lunchtime. So unless somebody has a super important question, I'll just kind of be up here. Thank you for coming.